Afternoon. My name is Tom Harris. I'm the director of the University Center for Economic Development at UNR. And today we're going to have our guest speaker is Don Macke. Don is the vice president of E2, which is known Entrepreneurial Ecosystems. Worked with Don a lot. Don's been in Nevada. He worked with Sarah Adler a little bit when she would have him over from USDA. But like I said, we went out even Eureka. We'd been to other places talking about entrepreneurship. He's had 40 years of experience with community development and policy and entrepreneurship and small businesses, especially in rural America. And with the COVID-19 going on, Nevada has had some interesting impacts. I sent him some information. Nebraska has the lowest unemployment rate of 3.6%. Nevada is second to the nation. I forgot my numbers here, but it's pretty big. But all of us know about that. But also what's coming out is, I hope you address a little bit, is that with the vaccine, we're maybe coming out of this. And so what does it mean? What kind of strategies can go on and this kind of other things? And so I wanted this to be a rural type of, not so much a metro influence. So that's why I had Don. And so Don, carry it away. Appreciate you taking time for us.
Well, great, Tom. It's good to reconnect with you and folks. Thank you for making time today. Happy to join in and do share your questions and comments. Let's make this a conversation. I guess let me start with this. During the Great Recession, and it's hard to believe that that was just a decade ago, and at that time we labeled it the deepest economic contraction since the Great Depression, and now we're in the COVID pandemic and recession. But during the Great Recession, we had been tracking some trends with our friends, Mark Lang at the University of Wisconsin with Your Economy, Ben Winchester at the University of Minnesota, who does a lot of demography work across the country. And we were following some trends, obviously some of the obvious ones, the role and rising role of e-commerce, the importance of broadband. But we began to pick up in Mark's data that there was this kind of surge in remote work, even before we get to the current times. And that really accelerated during the Great Depression or Great Recession. We also saw related to that people were in fact being kind of forced into what we call necessity entrepreneurship. They didn't want to leave their rural community, or maybe they had lost their job in Chicago or San Francisco and they moved home. And they were kind of driven into entrepreneurship as a way to make a living. And what we found is a real spike in nascent or startup entrepreneurship during the Great Recession. And what was interesting is we watched that tail off, and it took a while. It was really well into about 2015 before we saw that kind of stabilize to a more historic trend. That a number of those folks that were kind of driven into that entrepreneurship space decided, I like entrepreneurship. I like having, my business and doing my thing. And they stayed and kind of transformed from that necessity entrepreneurship or entrepreneur into that more opportunity focused entrepreneur. And that contributed to rural community revitalization across the United States. And we saw this in our field work with certain communities on a more case-by-case kind of basis. And so that was an interesting trend that kind of corresponded with some of the other trends that were going on. Of course, Ben Winchester had been tracking for a long time this remigration trend, kind of counter to the urban or the rural to urban migration of 30-year-olds back to rural communities. That accelerated, and in many cases, those folks brought jobs or engaged in business activities when they came home. And that really surged during the Great Recession, then kind of moderated, but continued in the intervening decade. So a number of kind of interesting trends that were occurring, and we had been tracking this outsourcing trend based on some work that we were doing in Washington State and Oregon, primarily related with Microsoft and Amazon, that larger employers were kind of shedding legacy workers even well after the Great Recession was done. They were continuing to shed legacy workers, those full-time, long-term employees, and really moving into contract employment or contractual arrangements to get work done. And for those positions that didn't require them to be close to, say, a campus or a corporate headquarters or a distribution facility, those workers were spreading out across the country, choosing where they wanted to live and still connecting back. And at least in Washington State, what we were able to document through Mark Lang's data at Your Economy was a real surge in that kind of entrepreneurship. So, as we hit the pandemic recession with, the fact that not only was this a recession, but it was induced by a health crisis, we were curious to see if, these same trends would accelerate, if they would manifest like they did during the Great Recession. I think it's fair to say it's too soon. But last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City came out with a study and said there's a surge, at least in their federal reserve district, in nascent entrepreneurship, that kind of necessity entrepreneurs. Pretty compelling research that they're picking up in their data sets that would kind of confirm that, okay, at least that trend is at play, and it's probably accelerating as well. So it's hard with the tragedy going on with the pandemic to talk about silver linings, but I think for rural communities, really paying attention to some of these trends, remote work, outsourcing, the role of technology in being able to engage in economic activity, rising levels of entrepreneurship. These are all really powerful opportunities when you then couple them with some of the counter migration trends of not only 30-year-olds, but we're also seeing a pretty strong pattern of early retirees, this huge wave of boomers. There's 10,000 a day of us. I'm not there yet, but I got my Medicare card this last week. And as they retire, a portion of them are going to move back to rural because of cost and congestion and lifestyle choices. Some recent research in the New York Times really kind of pointed out that, if you're in LA and you've got a house that's worth $2 million, but you really haven't done very good saving for your retirement, you can move to a place like Bisbee in the mountains, just south and east of Tucson. You can buy a place that probably is going to need some work for a couple of $100,000, put $100,000 into it, make it really nice, and you're going to clear 1.4 million. And, properly invested, that's going to generate a $50,000 to $100,000 a year income for you. And so, I thought that story was really telling about this opportunity of not only now 30-year-olds, but probably retiring boomers, a portion of whom are going to go back or move into more rural areas. Bottom line, and then I'll stop and we can take some questions, is are communities ready? Are they paying attention to these trends? Chances are there's already indicators in their community at the ground level they're happening. And are they positioning themselves for being the kind of community that's going to welcome these folks, provide the kind of experiences, based on the assets of the communities like Bisbee is doing to really make this a possibility. Kind of reminds me, Tom, of some of the work we did with Sarah up in Reno around the Tesla development before, as they were breaking ground.
Sure. Well, I got a few questions. I'll get started on some things. what we have, we've had spiking going on, and we're having closures. Have y'all bumped into things of helping businesses go through this up, down, up, and they're open one moment and they close the next? That's one of the things, and we're really getting close to, I think, tipping points for folks.
Well, there's been a lot of numbers out there as to, and of course, I think the difference between Nevada and Nebraska's unemployment rate is your dependence on hospitality compared to our dependence on hospitality. And there's no question that in certain sectors of the economy, this is a very uneven recession. We're going to see permanent damage. We're going to lose businesses. And, some folks talk about 20, 30%. And of course, the longer this goes on, not only are we going to lose businesses, but businesses are going to be damaged, and some of them will eventually fail. And so that's tragic, that's hard. But again, from a community standpoint, the question is, if you lose that great rural cafe because somebody just couldn't weather the storm, the market is still there for that. And so as a community, and we're seeing evidence of this where the Economic Development Corporation is coming in and trying to acquire those buildings with the equipment so that they got something to offer to somebody to come in and reopen that cafe, as opposed to selling off all the equipment where somebody would have to build from scratch to reopen the cafe. So there's going to be damage done. It's going to be tragic. But again, there are things that communities can do to position themselves to rebuild. We kind of use the symmetry of, restart, rebuild, and resiliency. How do we do this in a way that we position ourselves to actually build a stronger economy long term? It's tough. I know in some of the rural communities where we have really strong entrepreneurial ecosystems, boy, they've really stepped up and refinanced, providing grace periods just to buy, some of those hospitality businesses, those retail businesses a little more time, but also work with them. And boy, this is a tired term, but I think it's still the right term. Helping businesses pivot. How do they evolve themselves where maybe they don't have street traffic, but they can still get into certain markets using e-commerce and other strategies? There's great examples of businesses that have done that. And again, it's a huge shift for them, but it's buying them time. It's probably going to position them to be a stronger business in the future. But there are also those that simply can't figure out how to do that, and they're going to be destroyed, or they're going to be weakened to where eventually they do fail, and we're going to have to rebuild back from these losses.
I have one more question to open it up. Your question, a lot of things have been moving, like I said, the rules, and in California, a lot of people, even I understand Google is allowing people to work off campus, even move to places like Reno, maybe for a loss and decrease in salary, but it's been coming more and more. That's one of the things we've been benefiting by. How can rural counties look at capturing some of this flow from urban to rural?
Well, I do think it's real. I know here in Lincoln, of course, we're a community of about 300,000, but State Farm has a large operation here with over 1,000 employees. They had them all go to remote work at home. They've basically made the corporate decision that they will not be reopening their corporate complex here in Lincoln. They're going to put it up for sale. That entire workforce is going to go to remote work. And that means people are potentially going to have options to decide a wider range of communities where they live, because they will not have the same kind of commute requirement that they did if they were keeping regular office hours. And so I think that's happening. And it's one of the trends that we're tracking, Tom. Again, I think it comes back to the fact that, is the community prepared to do the right things to attract people? And, maybe somebody who grew up there that wants to come back. It may be somebody whose grandparents were in the community and they've got a good memory and they want to come back. But this is the time, while COVID is still a challenge for us, that communities should be getting themselves ready to tap into these trends. And I just think it's, up to the community to understand, and institutions like the University of Nevada, our shop, and others, we can help communities understand these trends and what they need to do to position themselves to take advantage of it. But boy, we've learned so much about remote work because of COVID. I think our world's going to change in terms of office and remote work ways of doing business. Not totally, obviously, but to probably a much larger degree than would have occurred naturally without the pandemic.
I don't know. Anybody have any questions? Dick, you got a question?
Yeah, from my perspective, one of the concerns has to do with the rate of change.
Yeah.
That one of the things we're seeing in Reno is that as both our industry base is growing and as people are relocating here, housing prices have gone up. And so that's both for sale housing as well as rental housing, and the amount of homelessness is increasing dramatically. And part of that is because of housing prices. Part of that is because of unemployment driven by COVID. But I'm wondering, is that pushing out to smaller rural communities as well? Is there an increase in homelessness and issues like that as a result of the rate of change of people migrating back to rurals?
Yeah, I think great question. And it seems to me, think of it as kind of core ring and outer ring. So if you think about, and we just did some analysis on this, we call the urban America pushing out into rural. And so, if we look at the median house price in San Francisco, it's $1.4 million. It's about $500,000 in Portland. For some time now, people out in Northern California, Portland and Seattle have been moving into South Central and Central Oregon, communities like Bend, Medford. And now those communities, because of the inflow of people, are experiencing much, much higher house prices. They're now pushing into the $200,000, $300,000, and $400,000 ranges on a median basis. And the communities are also, struggling with growth issues, congestion, crime, et cetera. And we were actually working with Klamath Falls, which is not seen a lot of this, is just starting to see it. And, their median house price is about $200,000. And so we were talking to leaders in Klamath Falls development interests and saying, you guys are next on the list. As Medford and Bend become a lot more expensive, this movement out of Northern California and the big cities on the West Coast is probably going to continue, but there's going to be people who say, I can't pay $400,000 for a home in Bend, but I can go to Klamath Falls with kind of the same amenity package in terms of natural, public lands, natural amenities, aesthetics, and I can still buy a property for, again, 150, 200,000, and I can put 50 or 100,000 in it and have a really great place and pocket the difference. So I think that's going to happen. I think for places like Reno, where it's already happening, how do we become more aggressive in, as we work with developers to create mixed use development where there is affordable housing that is part of the deal of being able to build the higher priced, larger margin housing. So that gentrification, if you want to call it that, that's occurring, just doesn't simply create a stilted housing market where working class folks have to just go further out, but can actually take up residency in the community where they're working. Again, that might go a little bit against our kind of politics of not being too intervention in the market, but we're working with a neighborhood south of the downtown in Lincoln that, has been in decline for probably 50 years. It's now starting to gentrify. The discussion is that if you want to go in and redevelop that housing, you're going to do it on a mixed use basis where some of that is going to be affordable housing to create a wider price range. And that's just part of the deal of being able to take that asset that's close to a lot of employment and is now pretty desirable from a location standpoint and develop it a little bit differently to ensure that, not everybody's squeezed out of the housing market. It's not my expertise area, but I'm fascinated by it because I do think that these trends are really powerful and that high costs in core cities is pushing out into ever more rural locations.
Any other questions you like, Dick, or are you all right?
Well, I got a lot of questions, so but I'll ask one more and I'll give somebody else a chance. So when you talk about rural entrepreneurship, do you make any differentiation between what years ago is referred to as the lone eagles, and that is someone either as a independent contractor or as a distance employee moving out into a more rural area, as opposed to someone who is creating employment and hiring other people? Do you differentiate at all? I know both of them contribute to the economic base in the rural area, but one of them creates new jobs directly, and the other one just adds a little bit to the economic base.
Yeah, I think there's examples of both of those that are at play right now. I mean, if you think about all of the business services that are now available, it's possible with 2 or 3 or 4 people to create a corporate headquarters, farm out your logistics, farm out your manufacturing, if we're thinking about that kind of firm. I think one of my favorite businesses was a young man up in Valentine, Nebraska, a community of a couple of thousand. He and his grandma designed and manufactured a really unique kind of doll, kind of an unusual product in ranching country in the Sandhills of Nebraska. And initially, he did piecework with people in the area who were willing to sew and help him manufacture those. Well, eventually, he created a small corporate headquarters and he outsourced all of this production to China just because of the cost differential. Now, as that became a problem, he's now brought some of that production back to the States in a more formal kind of manufacturing regime. So I think this is a really fluid field, but I think we'll continue to see both of those kinds of ventures evolving. And I also think entrepreneurs are going to experiment. On surface, it sounds like if I can outsource everything, that's wonderful. But the challenge is you do have less control and you're really dependent upon reliable supply chains. And if something disrupts that supply chain or your distribution chain, and you have very little control over it other than, you've got a contractual relationship, that can really impact your business. And so I think people are testing the limits and have been testing the limits with that, trying to find what's the right balance between, cost and the ability to maintain, quality control and to deliver to customers on a timely basis. Looks like Bob Hastings has a question.
Oh yeah, Bob, go ahead.
Thanks, guys. So one's just a comment, and then maybe you could help us, Don, help me understand a way to deal with this better. And the comment is, in the rural communities where we struggle is when we're trying to promote these ideas of bringing entrepreneurs in, bringing those folks that are working for an Apple or a Google or something like that and having them work remotely. Is in the rural communities, you mentioned building one house or bringing one person in, and you might as well just jump off a bridge because nobody in those communities wants to hear it, see it. So those that are trying to promote those things find that difficulty in bringing those and promoting those types of ideas. So that's just a comment. But maybe you could help me better understand, in the rural communities, probably the biggest thing we're going to run into, or one of the biggest things, is broadband.
Mm-hmm.
How does somebody working for Google move to Silver Springs, Nevada, where there's kind of not great, internet to the connectivity? And I just feel like we're kind of in that place right now where we're trying to pivot and be ready for this because it's exploding. But at the same time, those that have those things already, they're moving forward faster than we are because people are going to go there because it's already there. And those of us that don't have it are falling farther and farther behind. Do you have any examples of how communities could deal with that? Or I don't know, it's just a challenge we're seeing.
Yeah, no, we recently put together a paper for the Federal Communications Commission. And again, this is not my area of expertise, but it's hard to be an entrepreneur and not have good broadband. I mean, it's just, I use the analogy, it's like having paved roads and indoor plumbing. It's kind of one of those necessity things that you got to have if you want to go down this road. And I always draw on two examples, but there's multiple ones that we address in the paper. But before I get to the examples, I think, at least our view is this is less of a technological and a cost issue than a willingness or commitment issue. As we work across the United States, we find rural areas that have pretty amazing broadband that you can go 50 miles down the road and they have lousy broadband. And so it always raised the question as an economist in me is, okay, they both have the kind of same density, the same markets, the same topography. Why is it that one provider can make this work and another can? And what we began to see just casually was it all depends on who your service provider is. Chances are, if it's a large incumbent, they're not investing in rural communities. They're putting their money in places like Boise and Denver and probably Reno and Las Vegas. And they're making money in the rural areas, so they don't want to let those service areas go. But, where I grew up in Western Nebraska, it got to the point where the local incumbent, it'd take you 30 days to get a service call. It just wasn't a priority. If you were in Denver, 24 hours. I mean, it was a very different standard. And then on the other hand, you would find these companies that were figuring out how to bring high-speed, reliable broadband at a more affordable rate. And probably the best example is Allo Communications out of Imperial. It was started by a guy who grew up there. His family were grocers, worked for Sprint for a number of years in KC, moved home because he wanted to raise his kid in Imperial. Reconnected with his buddy, Brad Boline, who ran the local newspaper, and said, we should build a telephone company because service in Western Nebraska is just rotten. And they created Allo Communications in this tiny town. Their primary investors were farmers. Think about that culture shift, get a bunch of farmers to invest in a telephony company. And Allo demonstrated that they could bring high-speed, affordable broadband. And about 2 years ago, they moved into the Lincoln market, which is where I live. I've got Allo Communications. I've got fiber to my desk, 500 up, 500 down, reliable. And I'm spending about 80% of what I was with Spectrum. So, I think part of it is there has to be at the federal level and the state level regulatory change that says, if you are a provider of broadband and you're unwilling to meet a higher set of standards, and I think the FCC standards of what's acceptable are too low, then you should be forced to disinvest and to sell to somebody who's willing to try to provide, knowing that there are companies out there that are able to do better. I know that sounds simplistic, but it bothers me every time I see the federal subsidies come out and they're going to incumbents, but not to these innovative, smaller independent companies that are actually committed to serving their market and are finding ways to do that. We're even seeing this in, pretty tough country in the Rocky Mountains. I've got examples of REAs, rural cooperatives, doing this in, the Ozarks, very dispersed, hilly, tough country. I think part of this has to be a change in federal policy that says we're going to quit talking about equality of broadband in rural America, and we're actually going to put our money and our policy that incents and supports the folks who actually want to do it. But I got kind of political there, but it just drives me nuts that we keep talking about, oh gosh, we need broadband because now our kids got to stay home and learn from home. And, some have it and some don't. And we still, these are high cost, low density markets. Yeah. Well, then why is this company able to do it? And 50 miles down the road, you can't do it.
I mean, it's with this broadband with schools, Don, it's kind of like if you're a family that has two children going to school and the people are working at home, just one house hookup is a lot different from another one. It's just myself and my wife here. That's an interesting dynamic going on. I don't think people understand.
Yeah, and is assuming we've got more people who are going to do this. And again, it's not like the usage of broadband is going to go down. I mean, we're going to continue to innovate about streaming and other things that are going to require more broadband capacity. That's where the FCC, I think, has to be much more aggressive in setting higher standards of what is considered acceptable. I mean, with what they have now, you can't support two kids and two people working at home, let alone some of the more advanced telemedicine applications. I was just talking with Mosaic Healthcare, which serves Northwest Missouri. They've been driven to telemedicine in a way that they never dreamt they would because of COVID. They're probably not going to go back to the old way of doing business. They're going to do more remote monitoring with people who have heart conditions, for example, more telemedicine visits. But that means they've got to have the broadband to support those higher end applications. It's a huge disadvantage whether you're in a core city neighborhood that has bad broadband or a rural community that has broadband. You just can't succeed if you don't have it.
Got any other questions, Bob? No? I mean, yeah. Bob was a commissioner in Lyon County, which saw, you probably went through it, but and I'll have Daphne ask this question, but it's one of those that had great expansion before the Great Recession. Then, man, boom, it really hit them. And then now, Daphne, I'm gonna have to ask you if you have any questions. She lives in she's in Fernley.
Mm-hmm.
In Fernley, you probably went to Fernley, but you go outside here 15 miles, you go into the Tahoe Regional Complex, which is boomed, and then you go to Fernley, which is growing exponentially. I used to have a student of mine who's done very well, but when I went to visit him, I had to go through he had some sheep, and it was kind of like going to the frontier. It's changed. But Stephanie, you got any questions you might like to ask Don?
I don't know, questions more than comments. I think our struggle is really trying to balance the cost of housing and the impact of people moving in. If they're coming from California and selling their high dollar homes and coming here, it's drastically increasing the cost of housing. And what we struggle with right now is 60% of our community commutes outside of Fernley to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we balance that? And the reality is, while a lot of companies are going remote, for our population and our community, it is primarily dependent upon manufacturing and distribution, which won't go remote.
Right.
Because they have to go to the warehouses and work. And even in times of COVID, they have not shut down. And so it's hard for our community to try to figure out where we go and what that looks like moving forward. How do we bring people in to stay at home and work? So we're looking at, we have a huge industrial park going on right now. But to Bob's point, we have this dichotomy within our community where you have, old Fernley that wants to remain rural and folks moving in that want to urbanize it and want the amenities and want the service. But because of our state structure and our tax structure, we're dependent on property taxes, and there's not a lot of opportunity for revenue to be able to sustain and provide those programs and services and develop the infrastructure that's needed for good, solid growth. And so it is really a struggle, and Fernley isn't, we're not the frontier anymore. We're becoming more urbanized than we are rural, but we have bigger city problems with rural budgets and trying to figure out programs and services and housing needs for those folks that want to move to Fernley, because houses are $100,000 cheaper here. And it's a struggle. And I think, how do you get that entrepreneurial spirit here when we have that type of a workforce? And how do we as a city function when sometimes that development is needed for revenue and resources? So it is a tough balance, and it's a struggle to figure out how we move forward.
Yeah, great point. And not that I have any answers. Well, every once in a while you got to just be honest and say,
you're about as useful as the Nebraska football team.
Hey, we won last week.
Oh, my sisters are the blind one.
It has been a tough road, I have to admit, Tom. But no, I sometimes think that rural communities dealing with rapid growth is almost, if not more challenging than rural communities that have been in decline. Because you've got the rapid growth, you've got the culture change. Our tax structures are really set up to not support that kind of growth. And it just creates a lot of pressure. It reminds me of the time we were working with Saharita in Arizona. It's a community just south of Tucson, going through exactly what you were going through. And, one of the things they did is they said, and it looks like you're doing the same thing, is, most of our people get up in the morning and go to Tucson to work because there's all that industry and activity in the south part of Tucson around the airport. But they committed to an entrepreneurship strategy to say, we want to, number one, make sure that we've got more businesses that can capture the spending of those residents when they're in our community, so we can build a commercial property tax base to go along. And do you also get do you have a local sales tax that goes with your tax base?
Bob, should we talk about sales tax?
Okay, I took us into the ditch. Innocent.
All right, don't set me up, Daphne.
Our sales tax goes to the county.
Okay, all right. So that won't help you. But where you do have it,
I got to go now. I got to leave.
Yeah. that strategy helps. But and the other thing is, if you begin to foster that kind of commercial part of your economy through entrepreneurship, then you can begin to foster some rooted businesses that also start selling outside of the community. Those niche manufacturers, those kinds of businesses. So you begin to build up an industrial tax base. And so that was the strategies that Sartorita was pursuing, because they just could not be, subdivision after subdivision. And they had to build out those two parts of their economy, and that was their game plan to do it. I've not been back since we did that initial work, so it's been a while, but maybe next year when COVID's done, I'm going to go down there and take a look and see what they've been able to do with that. But it makes sense if you're fostering that kind of development, but try to capture those spending streams, because chances are, as you grow, your market thresholds for supporting certain kinds of businesses locally, even though people will shop where they go to work, in those areas as well, or on the way to and from, you can begin to capture some of that spending. And at least in your case, you'll generate sales tax for the county, and you'll generate property tax for the city, huh? How's that for a recovery?
Good job.
That's true. That's true. Any other question, Dan? Yeah.
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll go to Sheldon. Sheldon's like is in Elko, and in the Northeast is Ely and all that.
Yeah.
Just a quick little deal about broadband. I worked a little bit with the hospital there in Ely, and sometimes they'd hook up EKG with a cardiologist in Reno. They only had 5 megabytes, so sometimes I always had to ask, is the patient dead, or did our communications go down? But that it is necessary for business. But in Ely, the mayor asked me one time, says, "What can we do about broadband?" No, and it's just, all right, they have a big state prison. They can't keep young prison guards because they can't game. I said, well, there's a Nevada hotel. You can go play 21. I went, no, Tom, they can't hook up with Netflix.
Yeah.
It's a quality of life. It's also not only work, but it's a quality of life. You won't get young people. I go when the university was open, we closed a little bit because I go talk to my grad students, and they'd be looking on something on their computer. They're in a different world. There are people that watch people play computer games, and so this is not only necessary for us for economic development, just keeping people there. Yep. But Sheldon works in that area, which is Elko is a big mining kind of area, big going. They're doing great. They're not great. The mines have kept up going, but they have problems with the broadbands and other things. But Sheldon, what you got any questions you might like to ask Don about specific areas there in Elko and northeastern Nevada?
No, I don't know if this is really a question, but I know you going back to the overflow of people coming out of the urban areas into the rurals. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said that Tulsa was actually starting to incentivize individuals to come in there and move there, and actually give them a stipend or give them a check to move to Tulsa. Have you heard much about that? I mean, is that one of those drivers that's actually working? I haven't looked into it much. It was just something that I heard in an effort to try to drive or recruit, people to certain areas. In the past, we've always had way more jobs than we had people. So we were trying to figure out ways to recruit people, but now it's kind of leveled off a little bit compared to where it's been in the past, but we could still use a lot more people in this area. So I don't know, maybe that's for anybody, just thoughts on that. Have you heard that before, or is that something that's even worth considering?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's worth considering, but clearly other communities are doing it. So there's a lot of communities here in my part of the country, in the Central Great Plains, that they're offering free lots with no charge on utility hookups, or discounted lots, and other incentives to attract residents. They have loan programs to help with rehab. So if you think about a rural community, you may have housing stock that, again, my example before in Bisbee, you might be able to find a gym with good bones for, $180,000, but you're going to have to put $100,000 into it to make it a decent home. So, there's a lot of communities that are experimenting with that. I think that's useful. I'm not sure it would be I'm not sure it's the best return on investment. I think more importantly is, and again, this is what we're picking up from our people attraction work around the country is, there's this remarkable group of people, these 30-year-olds, these early retirees, other folks who are thinking about relocating. And it seems what they do is they've kind of got a part of the country that they want to locate in. And so they start doing web research. And so does your community really have a compelling website that talks about the quality of life, but also has testimonials on people who have chose to live there and why they've chose to live there? I think that's huge. I also think addressing your housing stock, so that, again, it's really hard to move if you can't find anything, or if it's so dilapidated that it's not useful. So, for example, Red Cloud, Nebraska, a community of 900, it's south of our Tri-Cities area, which is one of the fastest growing areas in Nebraska. They've got, at one time, this community was about 5 times larger than it is today. So they've got a lot of dilapidated residential property. And so what the city and the foundation and their development corp are doing is they're, first of all, acquiring and stabilizing those houses. And in many cases, they're doing that with private investors. So they've put together a group of private investors. And then they work with buyers when they come in to say, okay, we'll help you get the financing you need to rehab this house. And again, the scale of this may be 5 to 10 properties a year. It's not huge, but in a community of 900, that begins to make a difference, because not only are you rehabbing those properties and now you have people living in those properties, but they're coming back on the tax base, not as delinquent, but as, funders, going to Daphne's point. And so I think strategies like that, housing really is kind of the cornerstone of any people attraction strategy. How do you make housing available? And realizing you can't just go build a subdivision. I mean, for most communities, that's not an option. So how do you work with developers to begin to rehab the housing stock you have, build some new housing? Ord, Nebraska, Tom's familiar with Ord, Community 2000. They've done both. They've done infill, they've done rehab because they're growing. And they've also now started their first new subdivision with mixed use. And so there's everything from affordable housing for retirees and working families to higher end. So you got doctors and, working folks living in the same neighborhood. But it took the community kind of working together with the right developers to say, how do we build out our housing stock? And so if you don't have that, it's kind of like broadband, it's a deal killer. But that, along with good marketing, is great. And then, is the community, again, ready for new people? Because the culture issue can sometimes be a challenge. We want people, we want to keep our schools open, but we don't want anybody to be any different than us. And well, chances are if new people come to the community, they're going to be different than us. And we got to be ready to accept that diversity. And so the community's got to have a hard conversation about that as well. So I don't know, Sheldon, if that helps, but I do think a lot of communities use incentives, but I would look at how do you make sure that you have a housing supply that keeps the door open for people that are coming, and then make sure you're marketing well to let folks know. Because if they are searching your part of the country and say, man, this is where we're going to go, and they got housing, chances are you're going to go on the short list. You're going to get a visit.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any questions for Don? I have one more, Don.
Yeah.
Always, this is what it just occurred to me when you were talking to him.
No more university jokes, right?
No more university jokes. No more. Well, that picture there, I'm Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is Douglas County. And one of the things about California, and I know Bob and Daphne have this on this side, we get a lot of retirees, especially from California. And Douglas County on a per capita income is about the 20th or 21st highest in the whole nation. And it's because dividends, interest, and rents, the people retire. Sometimes people retire, they just don't want to work with anything anymore. How can you get them active within the community? Because these are sometimes people who've been, well, we could maybe say they could work with a SCORE group or whatever. How can they invest in our rural communities when they buy something for a retirement home, they're moving over here to retire, and get them part of the economy?
Well, I think reality is you can only deal with human natures to a certain point. And if you've got a couple that have moved into your community and they just don't want to get involved, there's not much you can do. But what we find is that particularly younger retirees, they do want to get involved. And their biggest challenge is getting the doors open in the community to let them get involved. So what we find is that, okay, if they want to just stay isolated and not do that, that's fine. But for those that do, and typically it's a majority of the folks moving in based on our field work, Tom, their biggest challenge is they go, I went to the chamber and said, I'd like to get involved, and I never heard back from them. And the same at their church. And so they're looking because they're active. They've adopted this new community. They want to be part of it. And we're not always very good at engaging that kind of volunteer activity. And we see the same thing with entrepreneurship. Maybe they've had this remarkable business career and they want to be a mentor. Are we prepared to figure out how to use their talents, their gifts, to support our entrepreneurial ecosystem? And so that means the chamber or the Economic Development Corporation has to be prepared to say, gosh, we've got somebody who really knows e-commerce inside and out and is willing to give time to work with other folks. But we simply don't take advantage of that opportunity. And of course, in time, they become discouraged and they go on and do something else. And we miss that opportunity. So, work with the people that want to do something, but be prepared to really work with them because they're motivated to create a new life in this next stage of their life. They got a lot to give. They want to invest. In some cases, they see a gap in the community and they want to start a great wine bar. Are we open to that? Are we willing to work with them in that? Oftentimes our communities are kind of slow to respond to those opportunities. And I think we got to be a little more aggressive, a little more open, so that when the iron is hot and they're ready to do something, we've got a way to get them engaged. Even though they've only been in our community for a few months, that shouldn't be a prerequisite to be involved in the Chamber of Commerce, or a barrier to be involved in the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
But they're going to bring different ideas, which we got to be willing to listen to them.
True. Yeah. That's one of the things. We're a retirement area here in California, and that's where we get folks like this.
Yeah.
I don't see any more questions, and I'm going to say I appreciate y'all spending an hour with us. Don, thank you very much for your insights with community development, especially here in the state of Nevada, which have been growing huge, and these rural areas have really increased a lot.